Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. My family would gather around the old, flickering fireplace, the smell of pine and fresh-baked cookies filling the air. It was a tradition that always brought us warmth, laughter, and a sense of comfort. The tree was adorned with twinkling lights, and the room was bathed in the glow of candles and the soft, crackling fire. But something about that particular Christmas felt off. It started a few days before. My parents had insisted we bring down the old attic decorations, along with the family heirlooms. Among the dusty boxes, I found a box that looked far older than any of the others. It had been forgotten, untouched for years. Inside, I found a collection of strange, faded ornaments, gingerbread men with missing limbs, snow globes that had long since lost their shimmer, and something that gave me a chill, an old, tattered, lifeless doll with button eyes. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I brought the box down to the living room. My parents were too busy preparing for the holiday to notice the doll or the unsettling sense it seemed to emit. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, my family gathered as usual. The fire crackled, the tree glittered, and the air felt thick with holiday cheer. But as we sat there, something began to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The doll was sitting on the edge of the mantel as if someone had placed it there without me noticing. Its eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went in the room. That night, I kept hearing faint whispers from the corner of the room where the doll sat. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers only grew louder as the night stretched on. I glanced toward the mantel and saw that the doll's head had tilted slightly as though it were watching us. At midnight, when we were all exchanging gifts under the tree, I heard a faint giggle. High and unnatural, like the sound of a child lost in the darkness. The giggle echoed from somewhere in the shadows, sending shivers through my spine. My family was too wrapped up in their laughter and joy to hear it, but I could feel my blood run cold. The next morning, as we sat down for breakfast, I noticed something strange. Beneath the tree, half buried in the snow, there were more ornaments, ones I hadn't seen before. They were broken, just like the ones I had found in the attic. Gingerbread men with missing limbs, cracked snow globes, and more of those haunting, button-eyed dolls. I couldn't shake the feeling that they had appeared overnight, as if the room had claimed them. After breakfast, my parents decided to go for a walk in the snow, leaving me alone in the house. I wandered back to the living room, the unease still lingering. As I sat by the fire, the whispers came again, this time louder, almost urgent. I turned toward the mantel, and there it was, the doll, its eyes now wide and unblinking. But something was different. It wasn't the same lifeless gaze I had seen the night before. It looked alive. The whispers had grown louder, louder than I could ignore. My heart pounded as I watched the doll move ever so slightly, its head tilting, its cracked lips forming a silent, wordless grin. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just a doll anymore. It had become something else, something darker. The whispering grew more insistent, and suddenly there was a sound, like the faint jingling of bells, far off in the distance. The lights from the Christmas tree flickered, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw the doll's reflection shift. Its smile stretched wider, and its eyes gleamed with a sinister light. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The whispers became a haunting lullaby, sung by a voice I didn't recognize. Then the giggling returned, closer this time, echoing through the house, as if whatever had once been lifeless had now taken hold of the room. The lights in the house began to flicker uncontrollably, and the whispers turned into a chilling chant that filled the entire space. The clock struck midnight again. I was frozen in place, unable to move as the doll's grin stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes seemed to glisten with something otherworldly. The whispers turned to screams, an otherworldly chorus of laughter and cries, and then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. The house was still again, except for the low hum of the fire. When my family returned, they found me sitting on the floor, trembling, the doll still perched on the mantel. I didn't dare touch it. They didn't ask about the strange ornaments or the whispers I had heard. They didn't seem to notice the flickering lights or the sense of unease that still lingered in the air. To this day, I keep that doll hidden, locked away in a box at the back of the attic. I never go up there without the lights on, and I never dare speak of the whispers I heard that Christmas Eve, because I know, whatever it was, it never truly left. I've always loved Christmas, the lights, the music, the feeling of warmth and togetherness. But that year, something about Christmas felt off. My family had always been big on holiday traditions, especially around Christmas Eve. We'd gather around the tree, tell stories, and watch holiday movies while snow drifted gently outside the windows. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, filled with cheer. But that year, things felt different. It started with the gifts. We'd already exchanged most of them by the time Christmas Eve arrived. The house was cozy, the fire crackling, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. We were all gathered around the tree when my younger brother, Ben, noticed something strange. "There's another present under the tree," he said, his voice quieter than usual. We all turned to look, and sure enough, there was a gift. It wasn't wrapped, though. It was just sitting there, unadorned, as if it had been placed there by someone who didn't care about the usual holiday wrapping. The tag was barely legible, written in messy, uneven handwriting. "To the family." "Who would leave this?" my mom asked, her brow furrowed. "We've already opened everything." Ben got up and approached the tree, reaching for the unwrapped gift. His hand trembled as he picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. He carried it to the center of the room and placed it on the floor. "Go ahead," he said, nodding to us. "Open it." None of us wanted to, but curiosity won out. I took the first hesitant tear, pulling back the plain brown paper. The inside was filled with soft layers of white tissue paper. Beneath it, we found something strange. A single, old, cracked mirror. The glass was blackened, as if something had scorched it from within. The frame was intricately carved, though most of the detail had faded with time. There was something unsettling about it, like the mirror wasn't meant to reflect anything we knew. Ben stepped closer, peering into the glass. "It's not reflecting anything. It's just empty." We all gathered around, but no matter how hard we stared, the mirror remained blank. It wasn't like a normal mirror. There was no image, no reflection of ourselves or the room behind us. It was as if we were looking at a void, a surface that absorbed all light, all sound. That's when the lights flickered. For a moment, the entire room was cast in shadows, and the glow from the Christmas tree dimmed. I swear I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, a faint, shadowy figure. But when I turned, nothing was there. "Just the power," my dad muttered, trying to sound calm. But we all knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched intensified as though the mirror was drawing our attention, pulling us in. My younger sister, Clara, clung to my mom, her face pale. "It's like something's in there," she whispered. The mirror wasn't just reflecting nothing. It felt hungry, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. My dad, usually the calm one, was visibly uneasy. He grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and shone it into the mirror's surface. "There's nothing there," he said, though his voice trembled. "Just darkness." But that's when it happened. The reflection in the mirror shifted, ever so slightly, but enough to make us gasp. A figure appeared, looming in the glass. It was tall, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It wasn't ours, but something else. The face wasn't clear, but the presence was chilling. The figure stepped closer, stretching its limbs unnaturally, as if reaching out. The lights went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. We could hear the heavy, uneven breathing of something somewhere nearby. The room smelled of something rotten, like cold ash and decay. Then a whisper, soft but clear. "Join me," Clara screamed, clutching my mom tighter. My dad stumbled back, his flashlight flickering uselessly. The mirror seemed to pulse as if it was breathing in the silence. The figure in the glass grew closer, its form bending and distorting as it reached toward us. I grabbed my brother's hand, heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Whatever was in that mirror didn't seem to care about Christmas or traditions. It was something darker, something that didn't belong in our world. "Run," my mom whispered, her voice shaking. "Run." We didn't hesitate. We bolted out of the house, leaving the mirror behind. The figure in the glass still haunted my mind, the sound of its whisper echoing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what was in that mirror or where it came from, but I've never felt the same about Christmas since. That mirror wasn't just a gift, it was something older, something that wasn't meant to be part of our world. And I pray I never see it again. The snow had fallen heavy and thick, blanketing the village in a serene, glistening white. It was Christmas Eve, and everything was as peaceful as one might expect. The warm glow from houses, lit by strings of twinkling lights and the soft hum of holiday music, seemed to promise the quiet magic of the season. I had always loved Christmas, especially the quiet nights when everything seemed to slow down. But that year, something felt off. The usual cheer wasn't there. My family had always gathered at my parents' house for the holidays, but this time, it was just my younger brother and me. No one else had shown up. We didn't think much of it at first. The snowstorm had made the roads treacherous and calls to our extended family had gone unanswered. Maybe they'd gotten stuck somewhere, or maybe it was just the weather keeping them away. We told ourselves they'd join us soon. For now, we enjoyed the quiet, peaceful night, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. But as the hours passed, that quiet began to feel wrong. The house was too still, too quiet. I kept hearing faint, distant whispers, soft, barely audible, as if someone were trying to speak from the other side of a wall. I assumed it was the wind, but even the fire crackling couldn't drown it out. At one point, my brother came into the living room, pale, rubbing his arms as if he were cold, even though the heat from the fire should have been enough. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head, pretending I didn't. We both knew we weren't alone. It wasn't long before we saw them. At first, I thought they were reflections in the window, shadows cast by the flickering lights outside. But as I turned to look, I saw a figure standing by the tree. A tall, gaunt shape dressed in tattered, faded clothing like something from another time. Its face was hollow, dark, and empty. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, watching. I grabbed my brother's arm, squeezing tightly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, as though waiting. Then more appeared. One by one, they stepped out from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. More figures, all wearing the same faded, threadbare clothes. They looked like they hadn't seen light or warmth in years. "What do you want?" I whispered, my hands clenched into fists. My brother clung to my side, his wide eyes fixed on the figures. They didn't speak. They just stood there, their hollow eyes locked onto us. And then the whispers grew louder. They were no longer faint murmurs, but chilling, guttural voices, each whisper filled with a sadness that cut through the silence like a blade. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes now inches from mine. I felt my knees give way. I dropped to the floor, unable to tear my gaze from the one closest to me. Its voice wasn't human anymore, but something ancient, something mournful. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably sorrowful, almost pleading. "We're waiting," the figure whispered. "We've always been waiting. tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't look away. My brother was frozen beside me, his lips trembling, unable to speak. The room felt colder than it ever had, as though the warmth had been sucked from it, leaving only the icy grip of fear. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The figures never left. They stood there, their eyes never leaving ours, their whispers growing louder and more urgent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The house was silent again. The fire crackled weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. My brother and I sat there, staring at each other, both too terrified to speak. When we finally did, it was barely above a whisper. "What were they?" I asked. "I don't know," my brother replied, his voice trembling. "But they were waiting. That was Christmas Eve, years ago. We never spoke of it again, but every year since I've dreaded the quiet nights around Christmas. Every sound, every shadow, reminds me that something is always waiting, somewhere in the darkness." It was the night before Christmas, and as usual, my family had gathered together to celebrate. The tree sparkled with lights, the fireplace crackled softly, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. It was a warm, familiar evening, until something strange happened. After everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up a bit longer, sitting by the flickering fire. The house was quiet, peaceful, and I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard something faint, almost too quiet to make out. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling, but then from downstairs came a distinct tapping sound, like something, was knocking on the front door. My heart raced. It wasn't unusual to have late-night visitors during the holiday season, but something about this felt off. I stood up, moving toward the stairs. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was probably just some carolers who'd come by too late, but something in the quietness of the night made me uneasy. The tapping grew louder, insistent, and I felt a chill creep over me. My eyes darted to the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Midnight. I knew no one would be visiting this late. Steeling myself, I made my way down the creaky steps, my pulse quickening. The knocking grew even louder now, almost as if someone was forcing their way through the door. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, unsure whether to look outside. I peeked through the small peephole, expecting to see someone there. Instead, I saw nothing but the darkness beyond the porch, the snow gently falling. But then I noticed something strange. The door itself was moving. Not the knob or handle, but the door frame, as if someone or something was trying to push its way inside. I could feel my breath hitch. My hands trembled as I gripped the cold metal of the door handle, ready to pull the door open. But before I could, the knocking stopped. Silence. I waited, frozen in place, expecting something else, but the house remained eerily quiet. After several minutes, I decided to turn back upstairs, still feeling uneasy. I locked the door, double-checking all the locks, and tried to convince myself that whatever had been outside was gone. As I climbed back into bed, sleep eluded me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the sound of my own breathing louder than anything else. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it, a soft, echoing whisper, almost like a child's voice, barely above a breath. "Santa, help us." My blood ran cold. I sat up, straining to listen, but there was only silence again. The next morning, I didn't say a word to anyone. The house was full of laughter and holiday cheer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been with us the night before. As the day went on, I noticed strange things. Footprints in the snow leading to the house despite no one having been outside. Even now, on Christmas Eve, I can't forget the soft whispers I heard, or the feeling that, even after all these years, we aren't truly alone. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. My family and I had rented a quaint old cabin tucked away in the mountains. The snow was falling gently, blanketing everything in pristine white. The air was crisp and cold, filled with the scent of pine and fresh-baked cookies. We had decorated the cabin with twinkling lights and hung stockings by the fireplace just like every other year. But something felt off. On Christmas Eve, as we were gathered around the fire listening to old carols and sipping hot cocoa, I noticed a strange creaking sound coming from the second floor. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the old wooden beams settling. But the longer I listened, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't just creaking. It sounded like someone was walking. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. Still, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I dismissed it and returned to my family, trying to enjoy the holiday. Later that night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard the sound again. This time louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. They were coming from the hallway upstairs. I sat up, my heart racing. My family was fast asleep, unaware of the noise above us. The footsteps continued, slow and rhythmic, like someone was pacing. They moved back and forth, each step echoing through the house, getting closer and closer to the top of the staircase. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it, but it wasn't just walking. It was as if someone was dragging their feet. Unable to take the silence anymore, I decided to check. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, the only source of light in the dim cabin. My hands trembled as I stepped out of my room, slowly making my way up the creaky staircase. As I reached the top, the noise abruptly stopped. Everything was eerily still. My breath caught in my throat. I shined my flashlight down the hall, expecting to find nothing but shadows. But then I saw it. The faintest trace of a figure standing at the end of the hall, silhouetted against the dim moonlight. I froze. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but I could feel its presence watching me. I wanted to call out, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered as if the battery was dying, and the figure moved closer, impossibly slow. In that moment, I realized what I was looking at wasn't human. Its movements were too unnatural, too deliberate. It seemed to glide, not walk, dragging its feet behind it. The shadows seemed to ripple as it moved toward me, pulling the darkness in with it. The figure came closer, closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. A voice, soft and hollow, echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't be here." Terror gripped me, but before I could react, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, when I told my family, they laughed it off, convinced I had been dreaming or imagining things. But I knew better. The house still felt wrong. There was something in those woods, something that had been waiting, and it wasn't done. The snowfall that year came early, blanketing everything in pristine white. It was the kind of Christmas Eve that made the world feel hushed and still, almost like time itself had slowed down. I had always loved the quiet of this time of year, but this night felt different, more eerie. I was staying at my family's old farmhouse deep in the countryside, far from any neighbors. The house had always had its fair share of strange stories, but I never paid much attention to them. On Christmas Eve, though, things felt off. The house, usually warm and welcoming, seemed darker, quieter, as if it were holding its breath. After everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the fireplace, the only source of light, feeling the weight of the silence. I glanced out the window at the snow-covered fields, watching the faint glow of the moonlight reflecting off the ground. The world outside seemed calm, but there was an unsettling stillness that felt far too quiet. It started with a soft, muffled tapping at the window. My heart jumped as I turned to look, but there was nothing. No one. Just snow and shadows. I shook my head and chalked it up to the wind or perhaps my imagination. Still, the tapping continued, now coming from the front door. My stomach twisted as I got up and moved toward the door. The tapping was slow, rhythmic, and persistent. I reached out and slowly opened it, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just more snow. No footsteps, no sign of anything or anyone that could have been outside. I was about to close the door when I noticed something strange in the snow. Footprints, but they weren't human. They were small, almost childlike, but the size was off. Too small, too narrow, like something that didn't belong in this world. I followed them with my eyes, trailing across the frozen ground, leading from the front door toward the woods. I shouldn't have followed them. I know that now. As I stepped out into the cold, the night felt heavier, colder than before. The moonlight barely cut through the thick branches of the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the snow. The footprints continued, leading further into the woods. Each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the darkness, and with each passing second, the sense of unease grew stronger. The whispers began then. Soft, indistinct voices carried on the wind, too faint to make out, but insistent, like they were calling me. I stopped, shivering, and strained to hear what they were saying, but it was like they didn't want to be heard. Something rustled in the trees nearby. I turned, but there was nothing. No creature, no figure, just shadows. The whispers became louder now, growing in volume, weaving through the trees like they were alive. My breath came in shallow, quick bursts. The footprints were still leading me deeper, but something told me to turn back. I couldn't. The trees closed in, growing taller and thicker, the darkness pressing around me. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, each step harder than the last. And then, from between the trees, I saw it. A figure. Small, so small it barely seemed human. Dressed in tattered, faded clothes, it was looking straight at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't cold or frightened, just indifferent. It didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, watching. I stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, now surrounding me, a cacophony of voices I couldn't understand. And then I noticed the figure was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched from ear to ear, exposing jagged, yellowed teeth. It wasn't right. None of it was. In the distance, I saw lights, twinkling, faint, far away. Christmas lights, maybe, but there was something wrong about them. They flickered erratically as if they were warning me, calling me away from this place. I stumbled toward them, drawn by some primal instinct, leaving the figure behind. As I broke free from the woods and saw the farmhouse again, everything was still. The house was just as I had left it, silent and untouched. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, the echoes of the whispers fading into the night. But something had followed me back, something I couldn't see. I know that now. The next morning, the footprints in the snow were gone, as if they had never existed, and in their place, there was only silence. I've never gone back to that house. I couldn't, and every Christmas since I find myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see those small footprints, the ones that shouldn't have been there. The snow had been falling since early morning, blanketing the town in thick, icy silence. It was Christmas Eve, and everything looked peaceful, untouched by time. The lights strung up along the streets glimmered faintly through the heavy snowfall, but the town felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. I had decided to stay at home that night, nestled in front of a crackling fire sipping hot cocoa while the storm raged outside. The house felt warm, familiar, and safe. My family was all out of town, and while I usually loved the quiet solitude, there was something about that night that made me uneasy. Around midnight, I was drifting off to sleep when I heard the faintest sound, a soft knock at the front door. It wasn't the usual hurried knocking from delivery drivers or neighbors. This was deliberate, slow, almost hesitant. I sat up, listening. My heart thudded in my chest. Who could be outside on Christmas Eve in this storm? I crept toward the door, peeking through the peephole. All I saw was white, endless snow stretching in every direction. No footprints, no figures, just the quiet expanse of whiteness. The knocking came again, sharper this time, more insistent. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door a crack. The cold hit me like a punch to the face, but there was no one there. Nothing but snow, undisturbed and untouched by human presence. "Must have been the wind," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I closed the door, locking it securely, but the sensation of being watched lingered. A few minutes passed, and I returned to my seat by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But as I sat there, my eyes kept drifting toward the front window. Something was off. The snow outside was untouched, but I could swear I saw movement in the distance, shapes shifting just beyond the edge of the light from my porch. I stood, grabbing a flashlight, and stepped onto the front porch. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, but the figure, or whatever it was, had vanished. I swept the beam of light across the snow, searching, but there was nothing there. Just more white. I decided to stay inside after that, barricading myself in the house, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear the faintest sound, soft footsteps in the snow, shuffling closer. At dawn, I peeked out the window, half expecting to see something unnatural. The snow had stopped, and everything looked untouched, serene once again. But as I scanned the landscape, my stomach twisted. The footprints were there, faint, disappearing into the trees at the edge of town. No one should have been outside, especially not in this storm. That's when I saw it, standing beneath the last fading light of dawn. A figure, cloaked in a ragged red coat, staring directly at me from across the street. No face, no features, just hollow, dark eyes that seemed to look right into my soul. It didn't move, just stood there, unmoving, watching. I slammed the curtain shut, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window. Something wasn't right. The silence was too heavy, too unnatural. Later that day, I found a note slipped beneath my front door. It was old, yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were clear. "Merry Christmas, don't forget the gift." I still have that note, tucked away, and sometimes, when the silence falls on Christmas Eve, I wonder if the figure will return, when the snow falls again, and the quiet takes over. It was the week before Christmas when the first snow fell. The town was blanketed in white, and the streets were eerily quiet. I always loved this time of year. The cozy lights, the smell of freshly baked cookies, and the joy that filled the air. But that year, something felt off. My family had always kept a certain Christmas traditions alive, like the old wooden tree my grandparents had passed down, and the flickering candles we placed in the windows. But this year, it felt like something wasn't right. One evening, a few days before Christmas, I was in my room, listening to Christmas carols. The house was still except for the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath me. Then I heard it, the faint sound of jingling bells from downstairs. It was faint at first, almost like the echo of old sleigh bells, but it wasn't like any jingle I'd ever heard before. Thinking it was my dad, I hurried to the top of the stairs and leaned over the railing, calling out, "Dad, are you there?" No answer. I crept down the stairs, the sound of the jingling bells growing louder with each step. My heart pounded harder. The air felt colder than usual, despite the fireplace burning in the living room. When I reached the bottom, I followed the sound into the living room. The old tree stood in the corner, adorned with fragile ornaments and twinkling lights. But something was off. Beneath the tree was a pile of gifts that hadn't been there before. They weren't wrapped in festive paper, but covered in worn, faded burlap sacks, secured with strings of twine. I moved closer, my breath fogging in the cold air. The bells echoed in my ears, and I felt like something was watching me. I knelt down, reaching out to touch one of the strange gifts, but my hand froze just inches away. something wasn't right about these presents. They felt wrong. Not simply because of their appearance, but because of the sheer emptiness they seemed to carry, as though whatever was inside didn't belong in our world. Suddenly, I heard the faint sound of soft, whispering voices, barely audible, as though they were speaking from far away. I turned to look behind me, but the room was still and silent except for the crackling of the fire. And then, from somewhere above, I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the roof. The jingling grew louder, now more frantic, and I could swear they were drawing closer. My breath hitched as I strained to listen. The whispering voices seemed closer, as if they were whispering to me, begging, pleading. I ran back to the staircase and looked up. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath me, and as I reached the top, I could hear the sound of something heavy, like boots, walking across the roof. The jingling of the bells became more urgent, closer. It wasn't the sound of Santa's sleigh. It wasn't jolly, festive bells. It was something darker, something sinister. I hurried to my room, slamming the door behind me, and locked it. I stood by the window, peering out, my breath fogging up the glass. The snow continued to fall, untouched, pure and still. But the bells continued, fading slowly into the night. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of jingling bells haunted me until dawn. And though Christmas came and the day passed like any other, I couldn't forget the noise. The following days, the townspeople began talking about it. They spoke of strange figures seen walking in the snow, their silhouettes lost beneath the trees, their faint whispers carried by the wind. No one knew what they were, only that the bells always came first. To this day, I don't know what I heard or saw that night. All I know is that some things aren't meant to be part of Christmas. And sometimes, the bells that bring joy to others carry something far more chilling than the season's cheer. The Christmas lights strung up around the town glowed softly in the snow, casting a warm, festive glow. But something about the decorations felt off, something unsettling beneath the surface of all the twinkling cheer. It was late on Christmas Eve when I noticed it, the silence. I had returned to my childhood home, a small, isolated cabin in the woods for the holidays. My parents had passed years ago, leaving the old place empty and quiet. But every Christmas, I made the trip back, partly out of tradition, partly because it was all I had left of them. The snowfall had started that afternoon, and now, hours later, the world outside was wrapped in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The cabin was small, rustic, built long before modern conveniences had come into fashion. I had spent the evening decorating the tree, the same one we used every year. Its branches were bare when I arrived, but soon I had strung up tinsel and hung ornaments, the old glass ones gleaming faintly under the soft glow of my lone lamp. As the clock struck midnight, I sat on the worn couch, staring out at the untouched wilderness. The snow had stopped falling, leaving only the glow of distant stars. It should have felt peaceful, but something didn't feel right. A soft tapping sound echoed from somewhere outside. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone brushing against the window. I stood and moved closer, my breath fogging the glass. Outside, the world was still, silent except for that tapping. I stepped to the front door, peering through the cracked wooden frame, but saw nothing, just snow and trees. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the chill crawling down my spine. Another tap, louder this time. I froze, heart racing. There was no wind, no breeze to carry the sound. The woods around the cabin stretched endlessly, their shadows deep and unyielding. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I spoke, but there was no reply. Just silence. Then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the trees, something moved. A figure tall and gaunt, its form barely visible against the snow. It didn't walk or run. It glided, like it wasn't bound by the rules of the world I knew. I stepped back from the door, my breath shallow and quick. The figure seemed to be approaching, though there was no noise of footsteps. no disturbance of the pristine snow. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The figure was closer now, and I could make out more details. Shadowy, gaunt, its face obscured by a dark hood. I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, something telling me to lock the door and hide, but I stood frozen. Then it spoke, its voice hollow, devoid of warmth or life. "Are you prepared?" I couldn't answer. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, like it was draining the life from the night. Suddenly, there was another sound, the chime of my old grandfather clock. The midnight toll echoed through the cabin, sharp and urgent. The figure stopped. It didn't need to say anything more. Its gaze was all I needed to feel the chill to my bones. The clock struck 12. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I bolted the door and locked all the windows, my hands trembling. The air felt heavier, darker. I tried to convince myself it was just the cold, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was no mere figment of my mind. The rest of the night passed in silence. I kept the lights on, every door bolted, too afraid to sleep. When the sun rose, the forest outside was untouched by the night's terror, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Whatever was out there, waiting beneath the surface of Christmas cheer, had returned. And I don't think it was planning to stay gone. The snow was falling gently as I made my way through the quiet, winding streets of the small town. The houses were decked out in festive lights, the glow from the windows casting a warm, inviting light against the frosted landscape. It was Christmas Eve, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of carolers singing. I'd always loved this time of year, but something about the town felt off. Maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that comes when everyone is asleep, waiting for the morning. I arrived at the old creaking church in the center of town. It was the heart of the community during the holiday season. Every year, the townsfolk gathered here for midnight mass, their voices raised in hymns and prayers. But tonight, as I approached, the church felt abandoned. The heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar, creaking on their hinges as I pushed them open. The inside was dark and cold, the faint light from the stained glass windows casting eerie, flickering shadows on the old pews. I called out, but my voice echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the stillness. "Hello?" I stepped further in, heart racing. It wasn't just the quiet, it was too quiet. No sound of the usual service preparations, no chatter or footsteps. The church felt hollow, as if the very life had been drained from it. At the altar, I found a single candle burning, flickering in the silence. Beside it, an open Bible lay face down. I approached, drawn by an overwhelming sense of unease. The candlelight illuminated strange markings on the pages, symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed old, ancient, as though they didn't belong here. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint whisper, low and gravelly, coming from somewhere near the back of the church. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out again, but no one answered. The whisper grew louder, closer. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. A voice, dark and hollow, muttering words I couldn't understand. The echo of the words seemed to reverberate through the empty church, filling every corner. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, circling around the pews. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there. No one. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking as I scanned the shadows. The whispers had turned to low, agonized moans. They seemed to be coming from all around me now, as if the very walls were alive, suffocating me. Desperately, I backed toward the candle. As my hand grazed the cold stone of the altar, I saw something in the flickering light. A figure, hunched over, its face obscured by the shadows. It moved unnaturally, gliding toward me like something out of a nightmare. "Please, stop," I begged, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence once more. The figure was close now, almost within reach. I could see its outline, tall, thin, with long, bony hands that clutched at something I couldn't see. The moaning grew louder, more pained, more desperate, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The candle flickered one last time, and darkness consumed the church. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers faded, but the air was thick, suffocating. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. The Bible lay open, its pages still marked with those strange symbols. I didn't dare look back as I bolted from the church, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets. As I made my way home, the weight of what I had witnessed pressed heavily on me. The town was silent, the houses now lifeless, the glow of their Christmas lights dull and faded. I never went back to that church. I don't know what I saw, what I heard, but every year, as Christmas Eve approaches, I still hear the whispers in my dreams, and the shadows seem to follow me wherever I go. The snow was falling gently that Christmas Eve, blanketing the world in white. It was a rare, peaceful snowfall, covering the small town in a soft, frozen shroud. Everyone was tucked in, waiting for Santa, the warmth of the holiday spirit filling their homes. But not all stories of Christmas are so comforting. I had always loved the quiet, peaceful nights leading up to Christmas. The smell of pine from the tree, the soft glow of the lights, and the faint sound of carolers drifting through the cold air. But this Christmas, something felt different. It started the night before. I'd been helping my family set up the tree, just like we always did. But as we hung the last ornament, there was a sudden, unsettling creak from the attic. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The attic door was slightly ajar. "It's probably just the wind," my dad said, but even he sounded uncertain. Still, we finished decorating and pushed it from our minds. After all, it was Christmas Eve, a night for joy, not fear. But that creaking stayed with me, like a whisper in the back of my head. Later, I found myself unable to sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards felt louder, each gust of wind through the drafty windows felt colder. I kept hearing faint, hollow footsteps from above, like someone was walking through the attic. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the noise was persistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, Christmas Day, the house felt different. I went downstairs to find that the tree lights were flickering strangely, casting unsettling shadows across the living room. The cheerful red and green garlands looked almost menacing under the dim glow. Under the tree, there were strange tracks in the snow. They weren't the usual tracks from birds or small animals. They were large, distorted, and seemed to appear from nowhere, leading toward the attic door. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic door was wide open now, creaking as if something had been moving around up there all night. "Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. I reached for the attic light and flicked the switch. The bulb flickered once, then died. Darkness poured down the stairs. The footsteps above resumed, more deliberate now, more insistent. It wasn't the wind or some creature outside. Whatever was up there, it was real. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? But who would believe me on Christmas Day? Everyone was supposed to be safe, happy, and warm. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They sounded like they were coming down the stairs. I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. The tree lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. But then I heard something else. Whispers. Low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me. I couldn't tell if they were voices or something else, something deeper, something ancient. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared from the top of the stairs. It wasn't the warm glow of Christmas lights. It was cold, spectral, like a dim, flickering candle. A figure emerged, obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and distorting. Its eyes were hollow and empty, but they seemed to be watching me, staring right through me. It moved silently, yet with purpose, descending the stairs with a slow, eerie grace. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it reached the bottom, its whispering filling the space between us. It wasn't Santa Claus, that much was clear. The figure stopped just inches from me. It didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. It merely stood there, staring, its presence heavier than the darkest night. Then, in an instant, the whispers stopped. The lights flickered back on, casting a cold, hollow glow over the room. And just like that, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep again that night. The house remained silent, as if the world itself had gone still, holding its breath. On Christmas morning, my family gathered around the tree, oblivious to the terror that had visited the night before. I didn't tell them what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe me? Even now, I don't know what it was, a spirit or something else entirely. But I know one thing for certain. Something walked through the darkness that Christmas Eve, something that was not supposed to be there. And sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear the faint whispers. It was the week before Christmas when we decided to rent a cabin in the woods for the holidays. My family always wanted to spend Christmas away from the usual chaos of our hometown. The cabin we found was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by snow-covered trees. It seemed perfect for a quiet, peaceful holiday. Just us and the stillness of the woods. The first night there, everything felt magical. The soft glow of the fireplace crackled, the scent of pine and fresh-baked cookies filled the air, and the lights from our small Christmas tree sparkled in the flickering firelight. For the first time in years, it felt like Christmas was truly about to begin. But as the night deepened, things started to feel off. It began with the silence. The forest outside seemed unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual rustling of animals in the snow. No howling of wolves, no chirping of birds, just pure, eerie stillness. I remember glancing out the window and seeing only the dark silhouettes of trees, the snow reflecting the dim glow of our cabin's lights. At around midnight, I woke up to a soft, distant chiming. At first, I thought it was from a clock or a bell tower in the distance, but the only thing surrounding us was a snow-covered wilderness. The sound wasn't constant, just a soft, faint chiming that came and went in intervals. I got out of bed, drawn by the sound, and peeked through the frosted window. The forest outside was as quiet as before, but the chiming continued, now louder, more distinct. It was as if something was calling from beyond the trees, a distant, haunting melody. I wasn't alone. My sister was standing beside me, staring out into the darkness. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We both listened, and the chiming grew closer, echoing between the trees. It wasn't coming from any bell, though. The sound seemed to float through the air, ghostly and mournful. Then we heard it. Footsteps in the snow. At first, they were faint, barely perceptible, but they quickly grew louder. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. They were not our footsteps. These were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, like the sound of boots trudging through deep snow. But there was no one in sight. We hurried back to the main room, our hearts racing. The fire had burned down to a low, flickering glow. My parents and brother were still fast asleep, completely unaware of the creeping dread settling over us. My sister and I didn't speak as we stared at the dark windows, waiting. The chiming grew louder, and then, right outside the cabin, we heard it. A soft, muffled cry. A child's voice, barely above a whisper, calling out for someone. We couldn't make out the words, only the haunting tone, echoing in the stillness. My sister grabbed my hand, her grip icy. "We have to get out of here." But before we could move, the doorbell rang. It was a faint chime, so soft we might have missed it if we hadn't been listening. I froze, staring at the front door as the sound echoed through the cabin. I was too afraid to move, too frozen to respond. We stood there, waiting. The chime came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I approached the door, my breath shallow. When I opened it, there was no one there, no footprints in the snow, no car, just silence, except for the chiming, which now came from inside the cabin. The room felt colder, the fire almost out. The glow from the tree seemed dimmer, almost fading. I could hear it now, the sound of small footsteps inside the house, moving, circling the tree, as if something was searching for something we couldn't see. My sister grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the corner of the room. We clung to each other, terrified. I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see something standing there, but the night was still. The footsteps continued, growing louder, heavier. I could feel them drawing closer. Then, through the dim light of the tree, I saw it. A figure. A child, its outline barely visible against the dark, moving towards us with slow, unnatural grace. Its face was hollow, its eyes empty voids. It didn't speak, but the chiming followed it wherever it went. Tears streamed down my face as I realized what it was. A child, lost in the woods, forever searching. And now, it had found us. The chiming grew louder, consuming everything. And as I held my sister tighter, I knew we were not alone anymore. Every year, my family made it a tradition to spend Christmas Eve at my grandparents' old farmhouse. It was a place steeped in holiday nostalgia, with creaky wooden floors, dusty ornaments, and the scent of pine filling the air. But there was always something unsettling about that house, something none of us could quite put our finger on. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old building settling in the night. There was a feeling, something intangible, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. Every Christmas we'd try to ignore it, tell ourselves it was the old farmhouse's charm, but deep down, we all knew better. That year, things felt different from the start. The snow had fallen heavily, blanketing the countryside in thick, untouched white. As we pulled up to the house, the glow of the porch lights flickered in the gathering dusk, casting long shadows over the yard. My grandparents were always so festive, always with their tree glowing brightly in the corner and the sound of Christmas carols humming from the old record player. After settling in and exchanging gifts, we all gathered in the living room, surrounded by the warmth of the fire. My cousin, Laura, made a comment about hearing strange noises from upstairs. It wasn't unusual. Old houses creaked and settled after all, but there was something off about the sound. It wasn't just creaking floors or wind in the chimney. It was deliberate. "It's probably just the house settling," my uncle said, laughing, though I could tell his tone was forced. As the night deepened, my aunt volunteered to fetch more logs for the fire, disappearing into the cold, dark hallway. The rest of us stayed by the fire, the sounds of Christmas fading into a quiet lull. After what felt like an eternity, my aunt returned, her face pale and eyes wide. "Something's not right," she whispered, sitting down beside us. "What do you mean?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "The door to the attic was open," she said. "And it wasn't like that when I left. I know I shut it." We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us had gone near the attic. The door to that old space had been locked for as long as I could remember. No one dared go up there. My grandfather, a proud, stoic man, stood from his chair, his expression hardening. "I'll check it out," he said, his tone firm. The rest of us followed him despite our better judgment. The staircase to the attic creaked under his weight as he ascended. The rest of us stood at the bottom, listening to the slow, measured steps echoing above. "Anything up there?" my uncle called, after what felt like an eternity. "No," came my grandfather's reply. "Nothing but dust and old boxes." But the uncertainty remained in his voice, and his quick descent back down the stairs did little to comfort us. As he reached the bottom, he looked pale and troubled. "Something felt off," he muttered, shaking his head. We tried to brush it off, though the tension in the room was palpable. As the evening went on, we went back to the living room, trying to carry on as usual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something wasn't done with us. It wasn't until we heard the soft jingle of bells that we all froze. The sound was faint, far away, almost too quiet to hear. But there it was, like the faint echo of a distant sleigh. It grew louder, approaching from the attic stairs. "Maybe it's just the wind," my father said, his voice shaky. But there was no wind, and now we all heard the distinct sound of something heavy, trudging down the stairs. My grandfather stood again, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice shaking. "I'll check." Slowly, he made his way to the foot of the staircase. The rest of us clung to each other, our eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The bells had stopped, and now we heard nothing but silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. After what felt like an eternity, my grandfather returned, his face ghostly. "There's nothing there," he said, but his voice was barely audible. We didn't stay much longer. We packed our things in haste, feeling the cold creeping in from outside. The farmhouse felt alive in a way it never had before. Watching, waiting. The next morning, we searched the house thoroughly, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no traces of the strange events we had witnessed. The attic door remained locked, just as it had been for decades. To this day, none of us speak of that Christmas night. The farmhouse is still in the family, but it feels different now, colder, more distant. Every year, as we gather around the fire, there's an unspoken fear that something lingers there, watching from the shadows of Christmas past. Christmas Eve had always been a time of warmth and joy for me. Family gathered around the tree, laughter, the scent of pine filling the air. But that year, something felt different. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the holiday season. It was as if the world had grown eerily still. We lived in a small town, surrounded by dense forests that stretched far beyond what anyone cared to explore. The snow-covered trees stood silent, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots in the snow and the faint crackling of the fire in the living room. The town had a charm to it, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. It started late in the evening, after the gifts had been opened and we were all settled around the fireplace. My parents were dozing off, and I sat in the dim light, staring at the flickering flames. That's when I first noticed it. The soft sound of footsteps in the snow outside. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was a neighbor taking a walk, someone out for a late-night stroll. But the footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate, almost like they were following a pattern. I leaned closer to the window, peering through the frost, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, a soft knocking at the door. My heart skipped. It was just past midnight and no one should have been outside. I moved cautiously toward the door, hoping it was just someone from the town, maybe someone who had gotten lost in the snow. But when I opened it, there was no one there. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. I checked the porch, shining my flashlight into the yard, but the only thing that greeted me was the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. As I stood there, puzzled, I heard the whispering again. Soft, indistinct voices carried by the wind. The air seemed heavier, as if the very night was holding its breath. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That wasn't the last time I heard those footsteps. The next day, Christmas Day, was when it all became worse. The house felt off. The usual warmth was gone. The fire crackled less and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. The laughter of my family felt distant, as if they were underwater. I tried to push away the thought that we weren't alone. But then, that evening, the knocking returned. Soft and measured, persistent. I couldn't ignore it this time. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door, trembling. The snow was deeper now, the ground untouched by anyone since the night before. I couldn't see any footprints leading up to the house. As I opened the door, I saw him, the figure standing in the snow. His face was obscured by a ragged hood, and in his hand he clutched a sack. There was something unnaturally cold about him, something that made my breath catch. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. The sack in his hand moved slightly, like something was shifting inside it. I tried to look away, but his gaze seemed to pull me in, colder than the winter air around us. The whispering started again, soft and rhythmic. It wasn't words I could understand, but they seemed to echo in my mind. "Listen," they seemed to say, though no one spoke out loud. I shut the door, my hand trembling on the lock. I backed away from it, the knocking fading into silence. But I knew he was still there, watching from the other side. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, the soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed to echo through the house. I stared at the Christmas tree, its ornaments glowing dimly in the dark, when I noticed something odd. One of the ornaments was swinging, even though there was no breeze. I got up, my heart racing, and traced the motion. The figure, the one from outside, was standing just a few feet from me, its gaze fixed on the tree. His hollow eyes seemed to stare right through me, as though he was waiting for something. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, he spoke. "Why do you celebrate? Do you know the truth about this night?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry and my mind was racing. What did he mean? Before I could even process what was happening, he vanished, leaving behind only silence and the faint echo of his whispers. Christmas Day ended in a cold haze, the shadow of that figure lingering in my thoughts. I haven't seen him since, but I can still hear the whispers on quiet nights, especially around Christmas. Maybe he was just a part of some dream, some nightmare brought on by too much solitude and cold. Or maybe, I still wonder, he was something else entirely, something that never left. It was the week leading up to Christmas, and the town had already descended into a festive haze. Lights strung from house to house, families bustling around with shopping bags, and the sound of carolers echoed through the cold, crisp air. But beneath the jolly surface of the season, something felt off this year. I had always loved Christmas. The warm glow of the fireplace, the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart, and the scent of pine filling the house. But this year was different. It started with the letters. Each morning, I would wake up to find a folded envelope tucked under the front door. No return address, just a crisp, formal handwriting that seemed almost old-fashioned. At first, I assumed it was a harmless holiday card, but when I opened the first one, my blood ran cold. The letter was short, but the message was chilling. "You'll never escape the cold of Christmas." I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't signed, just those words. I dismissed it at first, blaming the late-night stress and the strange winter fatigue I'd been feeling. But every day, the letters kept coming, each one eerier than the last. One afternoon, as I stared out the window, watching the snow fall gently, I noticed something strange. The street was quiet, unusually so. No carolers, no laughter, just a thick, unnatural silence. My phone buzzed, pulling me from the window. Another letter. I opened it, trembling this time. It was a simple drawing. A snow-covered path, lined with tall, shadowy figures that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Beneath it were more of those words. Follow the path. There's no escaping. My heart pounded as I looked outside again. The shadows seemed deeper now, the snow swirling unnaturally. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows like fingers scraping glass. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures from the drawing, standing in the distance, watching. At midnight, a knock at the door jolted me awake. My stomach twisted as I approached the entrance. The air outside was freezing, as if the temperature had dropped far beyond what it should be. The knock came again, sharp, deliberate. Hesitant, I cracked open the door, expecting nothing. But there, standing in the snow, was a figure cloaked in a tattered, old-fashioned coat. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with hollow eyes. Before I could react, they turned and began walking toward the snowy path from the drawing. My feet moved on their own, following them. It was as if something was pulling me forward, guiding me into the night. The path stretched on forever. The snow didn't stop falling, but now it felt heavier, colder. The world felt empty, as if Christmas had been drained of life. The silence was deafening, but I kept walking, unable to stop myself. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low, almost inaudible but unmistakably there. The cold is always watching. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the endless empty trees, their branches heavy with snow. When I looked ahead again, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. A figure much closer now. They were tall, faceless, but their presence was overwhelming. The wind whispered through the trees, as if pleading with me to turn back. But I couldn't. The figure began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. Then, as if breaking the silence, they spoke once more. You'll never escape what you've become. I tried to run, my legs shaking beneath me, but they were faster than anything human. The snow seemed to pull me down, dragging me deeper into the cold. My breath came in short gasps, my vision blurring with exhaustion, and then, in the distance, I saw it. The faint glow of a light. It pulsed softly, almost inviting. Desperate, I moved toward it, the figure still behind me, its footsteps echoing through the snow. When I finally reached the light, I realized it wasn't a salvation. It was a trap. The light wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, flickering like a dying flame. The figure emerged from the shadows once again, its face now visible, just a void where the eyes should be. Welcome to your eternal winter, lost one. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of whispers carried on the wind. Merry Christmas. It was the night before Christmas, and the snow blanketed the world in a serene, pristine layer of white. My family had gathered at our old country home, a place that had seen many Christmases over the years. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the atmosphere was warm, comforting. But something wasn't right. It all started when my younger sister, Sarah, noticed something strange hanging on the tree. At first, it seemed like another ornament, an old, faded figure made of fabric, resembling a doll. But it wasn't a regular ornament. Its eyes were hollow, stitched shut, and its grin was wide and unsettling. No one had seen it before. No one had placed it there. "I don't remember this," Sarah said, pointing at the strange figure. We all gathered around the tree, staring at the doll in silence. Its presence felt out of place, like it didn't belong. My parents tried to reassure us, explaining that it must have been one of those forgotten ornaments from years past, but something about the way the doll seemed to watch us, almost as if it was waiting, made my skin crawl. That night, as we tried to go to sleep, I kept hearing faint whispers, almost like they were coming from the hallway outside my room. I sat up, straining to listen, but there was nothing but silence. It was a soft, persistent murmuring, like someone or something was calling from the other side of the door. At one point, I thought I saw something move outside my window, a shadow shifting through the falling snow, too tall and unnatural to be human. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, we all gathered in the living room, the Christmas tree still glowing with its colorful lights. But when I looked closer, my heart skipped a beat. The doll was no longer hanging on the tree. Instead, it was sitting in the middle of the floor, its stitched eyes staring up at us. No one had moved it. The room felt colder, the fire suddenly less comforting. My parents were starting to look uneasy too. "It must have fallen," my mom said, though she didn't sound convinced. We exchanged glances, and then Sarah pointed toward the window. "The snow," she whispered, her voice trembling. The window was frosted over, but faint, claw-like scratches ran down the glass, as if something had tried to get in. Throughout the day, strange things kept happening. The doll would appear in different rooms, always sitting in the shadows, always watching. Whispers followed us as we moved through the house, soft, disembodied voices that spoke in a language we didn't recognize. That night, as we sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the walls, the whispers grew louder. The house seemed to shift, as if it were alive, watching us from the corners. Suddenly, the Christmas lights flickered, then went out altogether. The only light came from the dying fire, casting long, flickering shadows. The whispers grew louder, and then they stopped. The house was deathly silent. For a moment, all we could hear was our own breathing. Then a sharp, echoing knock at the door. None of us moved. My heart was pounding. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was outside knew we were there. My father hesitated before getting up, his hand shaking as he reached for the door. His voice trembled as he asked, "Who's there?" Silence, but the knocking didn't stop. Finally, he yanked the door open, and outside, there was nothing but snow. The yard stretched out before us, silent and untouched, the fresh snow glistening in the moonlight. We never found the doll again. It was Christmas Eve when it happened. The snow had been falling since late afternoon, covering the small village in a blanket of white. The village was peaceful, almost too quiet, with only the distant sound of jingling bells from a horse-drawn sleigh echoing through the streets. I had always loved Christmas, the warmth of the fire, the flickering lights, and the sound of laughter. But this year, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I decided to take a walk through the village, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The streets were deserted, the only sound being my footsteps crunching against the snow. The occasional street lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the empty cobblestone roads. As I turned the corner near the old church, I saw it. A figure standing by the bell tower, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His features were gaunt, pale, and distorted, like something from a dream, or a nightmare. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, as if waiting. Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just silence, save for the faint jingling of bells in the distance. As I backed away slowly, the figure raised a hand, as though beckoning me closer. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my home, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. The next morning, the village was covered in snow, the streets peaceful once more, but the figure was gone, disappeared like a wisp of smoke in the cold morning air. I told myself it had to be some trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the memory of those hollow eyes still haunts me every Christmas. Whatever was out there that night, it's still waiting watching. And I can't shake the feeling that it'll return one year when I least expect it. It was a few days before Christmas, and the town was covered in a thick layer of snow. The streets were quiet, mostly deserted, except for the soft crunch of boots on snow. We had just returned from the holiday rush at the local Christmas market, where the air was filled with the scent of pine and roasted chestnuts. The house had always felt different during the holidays. Old, like something from another time. My family had lived there for as long as I could remember, but tonight, something felt off. The holiday decorations didn't bring the usual warmth. Instead, the flickering lights cast unsettling shadows across the wooden floors and old, faded wallpaper. We put on Christmas carols, hoping to lighten the mood. But as the music played, something about the house seemed to resist it, like it didn't want to celebrate. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the corner of the living room. At first, I thought it was one of my family members, but when I turned, there was no one there. It was just a tall, thin shadow, barely visible in the dim light of the tree. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, a soft, distant whisper filled the room. A voice, low and hollow, as if it were coming from inside the walls. I hurried to turn off the music, but as soon as I did, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside or inside. It felt as though the house itself was speaking. The air felt colder, despite the fire roaring in the fireplace. My heart pounded as I crept toward the figure in the corner. The closer I got, the clearer I could see it. A tall, faceless figure draped in tattered clothes, its limbs moving in unnatural jerks. Its eyes were hollow, black as coal. Who are you?" I whispered, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it lifted one bony hand and pointed to the Christmas tree. That's when I saw it. The ornaments on the tree were shimmering, not with the usual festive glow, but with a faint, eerie light. The edges of the room seemed to blur, as though the very air had been twisted by whatever was here. Then, just like that, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. The whispering intensified, and I could feel the cold creeping in, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The house was silent once again, but I knew it wasn't empty. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that had never been part of our world, or our Christmas. The snow was falling softly as I made my way home that Christmas Eve. The town was quiet, the streets coated in a thick layer of frost, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of pine and cold. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, full of warmth, laughter, and the joy of the holiday season. But something felt off. I live alone in a small old cottage on the edge of town. It's the kind of place that's cozy in the daylight, but come nightfall, shadows stretch and twist, hiding things just out of sight. This cottage had been in my family for generations, handed down from my grandparents. Every Christmas, I'd tried to hold on to those traditions, decorating the tree, hanging stockings, setting out cookies for Santa. It was what kept the holiday alive, even as the years passed. But tonight, there was an uneasy stillness that seemed to hang in the air, a quiet that felt almost too quiet. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeted me, crackling in the fireplace. I hung my coat, poured myself a cup of cocoa, and stared at the tree in the corner. The lights twinkled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room, creating patterns on the worn wood of the floor. It should have been comforting, but instead, I felt a chill creeping up my spine. I was about to settle down when I heard it, a faint noise from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just the faintest creak, as if someone had walked across the old wooden floor. My heart jumped. I lived alone, or at least I thought I did. Slowly, I set my mug down and grabbed a flashlight from the table. The house groaned softly as I made my way to the staircase, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, too hollow in the silence. I reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the soft glow of the Christmas lights. The noise had stopped, but I could feel something watching from the darkness. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached the door to the guest room, the source of the sound, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, as though someone had pushed it open and forgotten to close it again. A chill ran through me as I pushed the door open fully. The room was untouched, exactly as I'd left it, except for the subtle scent of something unfamiliar, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old pine needles. Then I saw it, a figure standing by the window staring out into the snow-covered landscape. Its back was to me, and though it was motionless, I could sense something deeply wrong. It wasn't human. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs refused to move. The figure slowly turned, and in the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window, I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all, really. Just a void where the eyes and mouth should have been. Empty sockets where something dark and unknowable lurked. The creature tilted its head, as if curious before taking a step toward me. I finally found my voice and backed away, bumping into the wall. My hands shook as I lifted the flashlight, the beam illuminating its form. It was tall, too tall, and thin, with long limbs that seemed unnaturally elongated. But it wasn't the creature's height or its features that terrified me. It was the feeling of cold, ancient emptiness radiating from it. As the creature moved closer, I realized it wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet never quite touching the ground. It was like some twisted version of the Christmas spirit, something that didn't belong in this world, something that should have been lost to the shadows of another time. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice cracked with fear. The creature tilted its head again as if it didn't understand the question. And then, in a slow, deliberate voice that wasn't a voice, it whispered back, "I am the gift you did not ask for." I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. It took another step forward, and this time, I felt its presence brush against me. The cold it carried was unbearable, seeping into my very bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The room was empty again, the door now fully closed, as if nothing had happened. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours until I finally mustered the courage to leave. I locked the door to the guest room, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The rest of the night passed in silence, but the fear never left me. Every Christmas since that night, I've kept the guest room door shut, unwilling to ever open it again. I don't know what that thing was or why it chose to visit me. But every Christmas Eve, I can't shake the feeling that it might return, waiting in the darkness, watching. The snow had been falling all day, blanketing the small village in a thick, white layer. It was the week leading up to Christmas, and the town was wrapped in a quiet, festive atmosphere. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, shop windows displayed elaborate holiday displays, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and cinnamon. But something about that Christmas Eve felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, though everything seemed perfectly normal on the surface. The village was silent, and the only sounds were the crunch of our footsteps through the snow as we walked home from the local pub. We lived on the outskirts of town, in a small old cottage that had been in the family for generations. My parents were busy preparing for the holiday, but I decided to take a walk through the woods that bordered our property. The quiet of the night, paired with the soft glow of the Christmas lights still lingering in the trees, felt magical, even if something felt wrong. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the wind began to pick up, rustling the branches overhead. There was a strange stillness to it. No wildlife, no distant sounds of life that should have been there. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, I shivered and pulled my coat tighter around me. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like the tapping of fingers against glass. It was coming from somewhere deep in the woods, further than I had intended to wander. My heart quickened, but curiosity pulled me forward. The sound grew louder, more distinct. The tapping echoed through the trees, mingling with the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. I pressed on, the distant glow of our cottage fading behind me. The forest thickened, and the sounds became louder, more insistent. Then I saw them. In the dim light of the forest, I spotted what looked like shadows moving between the trees. They were not ordinary shadows. They were darker than the night itself, shifting and writhing as if they didn't belong to this world. They moved slowly, silently, and there was an unnatural stillness about them. My breath caught as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The shadows were drawn to a figure that seemed to materialize from the mist. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its form was vague, almost translucent, yet it seemed to radiate an otherworldly presence. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't alone. There were others, ghostly figures, their hollow eyes staring into mine. They seemed to drift between the trees, their expressions blank, their mouths twisted into silent cries. I could hear faint whispers now, carried on the wind, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, a flash of movement drew my attention. In the distance, I saw a figure moving toward me, moving unnaturally fast, far too fast for a person. It wasn't a person. It was wearing a tattered, faded Christmas sweater, one I didn't recognize, and it was pulling something behind it, dragging a heavy sack through the snow. I couldn't see its face, just the shape shifting between the trees. My instincts screamed for me to run, but my feet refused to move. The figure grew closer, its pace relentless. The sack behind it thumped against the ground with each step. When it was only a few feet away, the figure stopped, and I could feel its gaze on me, cold, empty, and infinite. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, surrounding me from all sides. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer. The figure only stared, the eyes beneath the sweater hollow, dark, and lifeless. Then, from within the sack, I heard a faint, muffled sound, a child's laughter. But it wasn't joyful. There was something twisted, almost mechanical about it. The laughter echoed through the woods, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure in the faded sweater, as it began to move again, slowly, dragging the sack behind it, as if it were searching for something lost, or something it could take. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran back toward the safety of my home, the figure and its haunting sack never far behind in my mind. When I reached the edge of the woods, I looked back, expecting to see nothing but trees and snow. But in the distance, I saw the figure once more, standing at the edge of the forest, its gaze fixed on me. The sack still over its shoulder, heavy and dripping with shadows. Christmas wasn't the same that year, and it hasn't been the same since. The snow fell softly, blanketing the small village in a pristine white. The streets were eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, especially for this time of year. Every house was adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths, and the festive atmosphere was supposed to feel warm, comforting. But something about this Christmas felt off. I had just moved into a quaint old cabin on the edge of town, nestled between the forest and the last remaining houses. The cabin was charming, with its wooden beams and roaring fireplace, but it had a history, one I hadn't been fully aware of when I'd signed the lease. That first night, as I unpacked my belongings, I heard faint footsteps outside, crunching through the snow. I peeked out the window, but saw nothing, only the glistening trees in the distance. The sound of laughter echoed through my thoughts, distant and hollow. I convinced myself it was probably just the wind or some lingering echoes from the neighboring homes. The next morning, I awoke to a strange noise, soft, rhythmic tapping on the cabin's front door. I got up and opened it, expecting to find nothing but snow and stillness. Instead, I was met with a wreath, slightly askew, lying on the porch, as if someone had placed it there and simply walked away. As the days passed, the odd occurrences became harder to ignore. I'd find small, childish drawings of snowmen and reindeer on the windows, their faces twisted into disturbing grins. The air felt colder, almost as though something unseen was watching me from the shadows. One night, just days before Christmas, the wind howled outside, carrying with it a low, almost sorrowful wail. I couldn't sleep, the sound too unsettling. I lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the snow fall in heavy flakes. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the front door. My heart leapt. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. No one should have been out in this weather. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there, only the same wreath lying in the snow. I backed away, locking the door behind me. That's when I noticed the faint sound again. The same rhythmic tapping from earlier, this time louder, insistent. It came from inside the cabin. I followed the noise, moving toward the attic. My heart pounded harder with every step. The door creaked open slowly and I climbed the ladder, the light from my candle flickering wildly. When I reached the top, the tapping stopped. The attic door was ajar, pushed open just enough to let a faint light escape. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it all the way open. Inside, the space was filled with old, faded Christmas decorations. Most of them were decades old, stored away and forgotten. Worn, tattered garlands, broken ornaments, and dusty stockings. But something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the dust and decay, there was a lingering sense of wrongness. That's when I noticed them. Hundreds of small, childlike figures made from twisted branches and snow. They sat in a circle surrounding something beneath them. Their hollow eyes seemed to stare at me, and their frozen smiles sent a chill down my spine. In the center of the circle, there was a small, rotting tree. Too old, its branches bare and brittle. Underneath it was an old, crumpled photo. The faces in the photo were blurred, but I could make out the outline of children, their features twisted in silent screams. As I stared at the photo, a whisper filled the attic. It wasn't words, but a cold, hollow breath. A voice I could feel more than hear. "They're still waiting," it seemed to say. Terrified, I dropped the photo, rushing down the ladder. I didn't stop until I was back in the warmth of the cabin. The door shut tight behind me. On Christmas morning, I found the wreath had been hung properly, as if someone had entered while I slept. But the drawings were gone. The sounds had stopped. Whatever had been there wasn't gone. I could still feel it watching me somewhere, in the shadows of that quiet, snow-covered village. It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around, which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit, but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. It was a bright, crisp autumn day when I decided to take a long drive out to the old orchard. My family had owned the farm for generations, and though most of the land had been sold off years ago, a small section of the orchard still remained untouched. I figured it would be a nice escape, a chance to walk among the ancient trees and clear my head. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of the orchard, weathered and forgotten. It wasn't much more than a shell these days, just some broken windows, faded paint, and a few scattered remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. I parked my car near the gravel road and made my way down the overgrown path toward the trees. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of fallen leaves filling my nose. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers toward the sky. They had been planted long before I was born, and now they stood as silent witnesses to the passing of time. I wandered deeper into the orchard, my footsteps crunching over the leaves that blanketed the ground. The silence here was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of a crow. I didn't feel afraid, just disconnected, like I was stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. After a while, I sat down under one of the trees, leaning back against the rough bark. The sun was beginning to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking in the stillness. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. The orchard was vast and empty, but the sound was there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It wasn't the wind or some natural noise. It was someone walking through the trees, slow and measured. I stood up, my stomach tightening, and began to walk toward the sound. The footsteps didn't stop, but they never seemed to get any closer either. I kept walking, trying to pinpoint their origin, but the trees twisted and stretched, concealing any clear view. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, heart racing, and the figure seemed to pause as well. It tilted its head in my direction, and I could see its outline against the fading light. But there was something off about it, a sense of wrongness. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could feel my breath quickening. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its features were too blurred, too indistinct, as though it were more shadow than flesh. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The figure seemed to drift closer, becoming more solid with each step, yet still somehow not quite there. A chill ran down my spine and I turned to run. My feet pounded against the ground as I pushed through the undergrowth, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I could feel its presence gaining on me, breathing down my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the orchard where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, heart pounding as I threw the door open and climbed inside. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. As I drove away from the old orchard, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure following me. It never appeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. To this day, I can't shake the sense that something still lingers there, among those twisted trees, something waiting for me to return. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive, the kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still, too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved, just a twitch of its head, too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures, all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream, they just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent. But no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room, the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder, the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like, something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. I've always loved the quiet of the night. There's something about the stillness that feels peaceful, calming. A few months ago, I took a spontaneous trip to an old abandoned lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. It wasn't a typical tourist spot, more of a forgotten relic. The lighthouse had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble under the weight of time and the sea breeze. My friends had backed out, calling the idea too weird, but I was drawn to the solitude. I set out around sunset, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack with a few essentials. The hike to the lighthouse was long, winding along cliffs that dropped off into the endless ocean below. As I climbed higher, the world seemed to shrink, the noises of civilization fading away. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of pink and orange across the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, night had fully taken hold. The structure was towering and silent, its paint chipped and its windows broken. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like stepping back in time, a place that had been abandoned long before I'd arrived. Inside the lighthouse was just as I imagined, cold and damp, with old wooden beams groaning under the weight of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I climbed up the narrow spiral staircase to the top, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing in the empty tower. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out in every direction, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the waves. I settled in on the edge of the platform, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The silence was almost deafening. There was no wind, no crashing waves, just stillness. I was about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but not quite. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Another cry followed, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it felt close. The sound was strange, almost like a mix of a scream and a moan, drifting up from the base of the lighthouse. I climbed down the stairs slowly, every creak echoing louder than before. I kept my flashlight aimed down, scanning the shadows as I went. The sound seemed to be coming from below, beneath the lighthouse. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was something else entirely. When I reached the bottom, the cries had stopped. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I walked around the structure, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. A figure stood just at the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the dark. I squinted, but they didn't move. They were watching, unmoving, just standing there. My breath hitched as I pointed the flashlight toward them. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but there was something off. The figure wasn't human. The light only illuminated their outline, distorted and strange, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic clawed at me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my chest heaving with each breath. When I glanced back at the lighthouse, it was silent. The figure was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night. All I know is, I never returned to the lighthouse. Some things are better left untouched, left to the silence and the darkness where they belong. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened, carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures, tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now, colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. Return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. It was a quiet Sunday evening when my family decided to take a drive out to the old lake. The air was crisp, the sky painted with soft hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The lake had always been a place of peace, a spot where we'd spent countless weekends, swimming, fishing, and simply enjoying the stillness. We packed a small cooler, grabbed some snacks, and set out in the late afternoon. The drive was familiar, the roads winding and quiet, with only the occasional passing car. As we approached the lake, something felt different. The usual sense of tranquility was replaced by a strange feeling of isolation. We parked near the water's edge, the gravel crunching beneath our tires. The lake stretched out before us, its surface calm and glassy. My parents unpacked the cooler while my younger siblings ran ahead, eager to dip their toes into the chilly water. I stayed back, sitting on the hood of the car, watching them. The sun had almost fully set now, casting long shadows across the trees that framed the lake. There was something in those shadows that didn't feel right. A stillness, unnatural, almost as if the world had stopped turning. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I could feel its pull. My head snapped toward the woods behind the lake. There was no one there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But the longer I sat there, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. My parents were still chatting by the car, unaware of the unease that had settled over me. I got up and walked toward the water's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were clearer now, though they seemed to come from nowhere. I kept turning in circles, looking around, but there was no one. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints leading down toward the water. They weren't ours. They were small, almost childlike, but the stride was too long, too deliberate. My stomach twisted as I followed the prints, tracing them with my eyes. They led from the trees, right to the edge of the water, then disappeared into the still lake. A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned back toward my family. My younger siblings had stopped playing and now stood beside our parents, their eyes wide with confusion. They hadn't noticed the footprints, but I could feel their presence. Something was watching us from the trees, something that didn't belong. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We hurried back to the car, the unease now overwhelming. I didn't dare look back, but the whispers followed us, trailing through the trees like whispers of something long gone. As we drove away from the lake, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those childlike footprints, soaked in water, following us. But they were gone. To this day, I still wonder about that evening. The lake has always been a place of peace, but something had lingered there. Something we couldn't see, but that made its presence known. The whispers still echo in my memory, though I haven't heard them since, and I doubt I ever will again. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave. But something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. It was a quiet evening when I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk through the park. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The park was usually bustling with families and joggers during the day, but by nightfall it became eerily deserted. Tonight, though, something felt different. Off. Max pulled gently at the leash as we wandered deeper into the park, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened trees. I wasn't worried at first, having walked these paths countless times, but tonight the usual calm was replaced by a creeping unease. We passed by the old playground, its swings creaking gently in the breeze. The air felt colder than usual, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the distance like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped, listening. Max froze too, ears perked. "Come on, boy," I murmured, trying to shake off the strange sensation that prickled my skin. We continued walking, but the feeling didn't fade. Every step I took, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around us, watching in silence. I glanced back once, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed remained. As we neared the center of the park, I spotted something strange, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like someone holding a lantern, but there was no sign of a person. My heart quickened. Max growled low in his throat, ears flat against his head. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone had lost a flashlight or a phone, nothing to be afraid of. Yet, as we approached the source of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The glow flickered erratically like it was struggling to stay on. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light went out. I froze, clutching Max's leash tightly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "Hello?" My voice broke the silence. I wasn't sure why I spoke. There was no one to answer. Max started pulling harder on the leash, his hackles raised. I could feel his fear radiating through the grip of my hand. I turned around, scanning the shadows beyond the trees, but they were still empty. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The forest, which usually comforted me with its stillness, now seemed alive, watching, waiting. Then, from behind me, came a voice. Soft, quiet, but not human. "Stop!" I spun around, heart racing. Max barked furiously, his growl turning into a frantic, terrified yelp. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice had come from the direction of the woods, clear and chilling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Max was pulling at the leash, nearly dragging me now. His ears were pinned flat, and he was growling louder, more desperately. I glanced around, but the park remained as silent and empty as ever. "Let's go, Max," I said, though my legs felt heavy as I turned to leave. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I could feel something, or someone, following us now, always just out of sight. The walk back was one of the longest of my life. Every step felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Max's barks echoed through the trees, but the presence that had followed us remained hidden. When we finally emerged from the park and the streetlights lit the world again, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I glanced back, but there was nothing. No figure, no sound, just silence and the shadows retreating back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, my mind haunted by the voice and the feeling of being followed. To this day, I wonder what it was, if it was real or something my mind conjured. All I know is, some nights, even under the safety of streetlights, I still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises. Something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful, a night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. "Help us." None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. "They're still coming." That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was just a quiet evening walk. I lived near a small town with few places to go. The woods always felt a little too close, too oppressive, but I had always found peace in the stillness of the forest. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a stroll down the old, barely used path that led to the edge of the woods. The sun had just set, leaving a thin strip of light that barely illuminated the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. I shrugged it off, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I walked. The path was overgrown, the grass brushing against my legs as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I moved further, I noticed how quiet it had become. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating silence. It wasn't unusual for the woods to feel deserted, but this felt different. The usual comforting stillness was now oppressive, almost as if the trees themselves were watching me. I kept walking, pushing forward until I stumbled upon something strange. There, just off the path, was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood faded and rotting, with a thin layer of ivy growing over the walls. I stopped, my curiosity overpowering the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in my gut. There were no signs of life. No lights, no smoke from a chimney. The windows were covered in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar. I stood there, unsure why I was even considering stepping closer. But something about it drew me in. I crept closer, my footsteps crunching against the dirt. The door creaked as I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The darkness beyond was complete, thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, revealing broken furniture, dusty remnants of a life that had long been abandoned. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was absolute. I kept moving through the rooms, uneasy with each creak of the old floorboards beneath me. That's when I noticed it. The faintest sound, a soft whisper, carried through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the cabin itself, but from outside, a whisper that seemed to echo from deep within the woods. I froze, listening intently. The whisper didn't make any sense. No words, just a soft, chilling hum, as if something was calling out. I didn't know why I did it, but I stepped toward the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, trying to see into the darkness outside. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence. And then I heard it again, closer this time. A faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. I jerked back, my breath hitching. The whispers had stopped, but now I could hear something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. Panic surged through me and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing there. Only trees, their twisted shapes looming in the dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, impossibly close now, though there was still nothing to be seen. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each step echoing louder, more deliberate. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound stopped. The cabin was silent once again. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I ran, not bothering to glance back. The woods felt alive, shifting around me, the trees now towering like silent watchers. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the open road, the lights of my town flickering far in the distance. Even now, I wonder what might have been waiting in the shadows. I never thought a simple trip to the library could haunt me like that. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just finished dinner and decided to visit the library downtown. I'd always loved the quiet, the smell of old books, the calmness of the place. It was something I did regularly, but that night felt different. The library was quiet, like usual, with only a few people scattered around, their heads buried in books or computers. I liked the peaceful hum of pages turning and the faint sound of the old fluorescent lights buzzing above. It felt like time moved slower there. I spent the evening reading, drifting through the stacks until I found myself in the back of the building. That's where the old section was, filled with dusty aged books no one really touched. It was peaceful, almost serene. But something was off. I remember feeling like I was being watched. The feeling started slowly, creeping up on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, but nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to leave, but as I passed the long row of bookshelves, I noticed something strange. At the end of the row stood a figure, tall and thin, just standing there in the dim light. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its posture was unnervingly unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that didn't belong, something wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered my name, soft but chilling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and tried to yell for help, but the sound got caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared between the rows of books. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether I had imagined it or not. The whispering continued, though fainter now, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the library. I rushed to the entrance, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I glanced back one last time. The library was still. Too still. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered once before dying out, plunging the building into darkness. I never went back to that library. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, but the whispering still lingers in the back of my mind, and I'll never forget the figure that vanished between the rows of books. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open, but what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. I'll never forget that summer evening. It was just a normal family trip, something we did every year, driving out to the old orchard just outside town. My parents, my siblings, and I. We had always gone there to pick fruit, sit beneath the trees, and enjoy the quiet, rural countryside. The orchard had been there for as long as I could remember. Rows of apple trees stretching out into the distance, their branches heavy with fruit. My family had visited so many times over the years that I hardly noticed the quiet, the rustling of leaves, or the way the sunlight filtered through the trees in that peaceful rhythm. That night felt different from the start. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, but it wasn't just the beauty of the setting sun that was off. It was the stillness. Even the air felt thick, like something was holding its breath. We parked the car under the massive oak near the entrance, the old wooden sign creaking as the wind blew through it. My parents were excited, chatting about how many baskets we would fill while my younger brother and sister ran ahead toward the trees. I lagged behind, lost in my own thoughts. It wasn't long before I noticed how eerily quiet the orchard was. No birds, no rustling leaves. It felt like the world had been muted, as if the usual sounds of nature had been snuffed out. I glanced around, but there was no breeze, no rustling, no movement of any kind. Even the ground beneath my feet seemed strangely still. As I followed my family deeper into the rows of trees, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. My siblings' laughter faded away, replaced by a strange silence. I could hear their footsteps ahead of me, but the normal sounds of nature were gone. The air felt too still, almost too heavy. When I caught up with them, I noticed my brother and sister standing frozen, staring at something a few yards ahead. I followed their gaze and froze too. In the distance, there was a figure. It wasn't human, but something wrong. Tall and gaunt, its limbs moved unnaturally like they were too long, too stiff. Its head tilted sharply toward us, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't moving like a person. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, almost like it didn't understand how to walk properly. It took one slow step toward us, and I noticed it wasn't wearing any clothes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tautly over its bones. I wanted to run, scream, do anything, but I was frozen. The figure didn't make any sound, just continued to advance slowly. My brother and sister didn't move, their eyes wide with fear. My parents were oblivious, still walking ahead, chatting like everything was normal. I finally found my voice. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Something's out here." They turned, faces puzzled. "What are you talking about?" my mom asked, but when they saw the figure, their smiles dropped. My dad's expression went blank, and my mom let out a small gasp. "Stay back," my dad said, his voice low and sharp. "Everyone, stay together." The figure took another step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't seem hostile, just wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. We all took a step back, trying to back away from it. The creature stopped a few feet away, tilting its head in that disturbing, unnatural way. Its hollow eyes seemed to be searching for something, or someone. "We need to get out of here," my dad said urgently. His voice trembled as he turned to lead us back to the car. My mom grabbed my brother and sister, pulling them along as we hurried through the orchard. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching us. I dared a glance back and saw it standing there, unmoving, as though rooted to the spot. When we made it to the car, my dad slammed the door shut, and we drove away as fast as we could. The figure never moved, never followed. It was just there, standing in the stillness of the orchard. I looked back through the rearview mirror one last time. It was still there, standing perfectly still, the sun finally disappearing behind the trees. Even now, I don't know what we saw that night, but whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be in that orchard. And sometimes I still feel like it's watching, waiting, just as still and silent as it was back then. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them, so close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting.